So basically, climate justice is working at the intersections of environmental degradation and the racial, social, and economic inequities it perpetrates. So this is a really big, I found this somewhere on like an official website. I thought it was a really good definition. But basically, in simple terms, what that's saying is that climate justice looks at how climate change worsens racial inequality, economic inequality, social inequality, the problems that already exist, how this makes it worse. And there's a few kind of important points within climate justice that we talk about a lot. The first one being the disproportionate impacts on low-income communities of color and indigenous peoples. And so when we think about where the flooding is happening, the islands that are being kind of drowned out, the places that are receiving droughts, the communities that are being displaced because of mining, because of logging, because of all of these things that add to climate change, this happens primarily in the global south. And so we're talking about a disproportionate impact on an area of the world that has had the least responsibility in creating climate change. Because that's another one of the things that is a part of climate justice, is the historical responsibility. So what is the responsibility of the global north, so of Europe and of North America? What is their responsibility in having to deal with climate change, considering that their entire countries, the entire wealth of Europe was created and built upon the exploitation of nature and labor and people from the global south. And we did this through colonialism. We're continuing to do it through neoliberal capitalism, which is like, go really deep into this. And so there is a responsibility that we have in the global north to be able to afford the luxuries and the quality of living that we have that is built upon the resources that we have extracted from the global south and the poverty that we have created in the global south. And so when we talk about climate justice, we have to talk about that. We have to recognize that a country that has really low carbon emissions should not be bearing the worst brunt of climate change. And unfortunately, that's what's happening right now. Like I was mentioning a bit earlier, it also goes a lot into existing structural and social inequality. And so a lot, unfortunately, because of processes like colonialism, the majority of the world's poverty is concentrated in the global south. And so what climate change does is it makes that worse. And climate justice also really has to do with community-led solutions. So one of the things, for example, that's discussed a lot is the right of indigenous people to prior and informed, I'm not saying this right, Chihiro, do you know? Prior informed consent. Yeah, so basically the idea that indigenous people should have the right to determine what happens with their land and with the resources that just so happen to be on their land. And unfortunately, that's not something that that happens at a large enough political level. There's a lot of local resistance all over the world. But for us to integrate this into kind of the big climate agreements that governments sign off on, that hasn't happened yet. Next slide. So I don't want to make my talk too long, so I'm not going to go into what all of these pictures are. This picture, you might actually recognize it because it's also a part of the photo exhibition. So this is quite a famous picture because it's a gentleman in Nigeria, in the Niger Delta, who, along with Milio Defensi, worked up a lawsuit against Shell for the pollution and the oil spills that they have caused in the Niger Delta. There are droughts. This is a picture of a woman who was displaced in the Cerrejón. That's the largest open coal pit in the world, which is located in Colombia. And fun fact, actually, in Colombia, more people have been displaced because of mining than because of the 20 plus years of conflict with La FARC and the other kind of internal, like not wars, but the internal violence and conflict that's happened. So more people have been displaced by the mining industry than by actual war inside of Colombia. But this is something that we don't learn about here because why do we have to learn about it? Like, we can just learn about CO2 and sea level rise and stuff. So this is a really important part of this conversation about climate change and climate impacts. Where are the impacts and why aren't we hearing about it? Next slide. This is just a picture that says, my neighborhood is killing me. And I was going to go into the fact that aside from kind of the big climate injustices that we see with indigenous peoples, with people that are displaced because of the fossil fuel industry, there's also a huge amount of kind of discrepancy between, that's not the right word, how do I say, like things like environmental pollution, air pollution, water pollution, all these things disproportionately impact communities of color, poor communities, poor black and brown communities, in essence. That's what we're talking about. And for example, when you look at the US, you have decades, if not centuries, of discriminatory housing policies that happen to put communities of color closer to chemical plants, closer to nuclear plants, closer to places where air pollution is higher, where water pollution is higher. And because these communities historically lack the resources and the political power to be able to lobby for solutions, the problems remain in their communities and nobody bats an eye. In the US, for example, black people are 5 times more likely than, not even just white people, but just anybody in the US, black people are 5 times more likely to live within walking distance of a chemical plant or a nuclear plant. So what that means is that these people are much more likely to be exposed to the pollution and the radiation that comes from these places, but we don't pay attention to that. And so, next slide. When we do happen to realize that climate catastrophes happen in places where there's a lot of black and brown bodies, such as the Caribbean, then we have the media that comes in and does its thing, and then we have, for example, what happened last year after Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Maria, where you have entire countries that are completely devastated, and what the media reports is that people are looting and people are stealing, and it feeds into this racist perception that we have of black and brown people. And there's actually I didn't include it on here, but there's a really interesting study that shows how the media covers when white people are finding food versus when black people are looting. This is all kind of racist discourse that gets kind of trickled into the news that we receive, and a lot of times we just don't really catch it. And so, for example, what happened after Hurricane Irma is that both the French, the British, and the Dutch decided to send troops to the Caribbean, because rather than sending aid, we need to send troops so that way we make sure that those rowdy black people over in the Caribbean are not just looting and, whatever. This was really the way that this issue was framed, if you paid attention to how it was discussed. the Dutch government actually at one point offered to give St. Martin $550 million or euros in aid, only on the condition that St. Martin would allow the Dutch government to take over border control. Why would the Dutch government need to take over border control in St. Martin? Right? Feeds back into this whole racist big shit show. So basically, so we could go really deep into that. But the media also plays a big part in how we perceive climate injustice, how we understand what people do to kind of adapt and mitigate to climate injustice. Next slide.
The situation changed now, right? They gave a big fund.
Yeah, the situation's changed. Yeah, I don't know about like the thing that happened like the last 2 days. I do know that they switched their mayor, and at one point the new mayor that they got approved this condition that the Dutch government had set about whatever, and so the Dutch government, in essence, that's what the previous picture was, has sent their troops, and now the Dutch government is the one that kind of is controlling, they control the airport, and they've got just troops all around the island to, I don't know, do whatever.
So you mean change negatively?
Yeah, I don't think it got much better, no, unfortunately. So this is just a picture of two kind of places that are a part of the Pacific Islands. The Pacific Islands is a place that we talk about a lot within climate justice because we talk about sea level rise, and then we don't realize that that actually has real impacts for communities and nations that are island nations. So, for example, this top picture, I'm not going to try to pronounce the name of this island because I do not want to pronounce it incorrectly. So I put it up there so that way we could all read it. But for example, this is an island within the nation of Fiji that used to traditionally be a burial site. What's happening is that these people are losing their cultural artifacts. They're losing their way of life because of climate change. So we can't just talk about sea level rise like it's this neutral thing of like, oh, the oceans are just going to come up and like, I guess we're going to not be able to go to the beach anymore. Like, this is real for people whose ways of life are completely being destroyed and displaced. And the reason I wanted to talk about this Fiji thing, if we go to the next slide, is because ironically Fiji was the host of last year's COP, which was the International UN Climate Summit, and Fiji was the host of that, and ironically at the end of the summit, the agreement, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Paris Agreement. I'm seeing some heads kind of yes. Okay, I'm going to assume yes. So, in essence, the Paris Agreement was kind of revived. They tried to go back to it, make it actually something that would be enforceable. But when you look at Indigenous people's rights, that is nowhere within the operative language of this agreement. So the agreement says, like, hold on, I wrote it down. It's really ridiculous. It says, the parties will consider their obligations on the rights of Indigenous people and local communities. Consider, as in, like, if you feel like giving a shit, then you'll give a shit. But until then, these people are, we're going to just let people drown. We're going to let people be displaced. That's not our problem. And so at the COP, there was an Indigenous Peoples Caucus, which was kind of the first time that they really formally organized that way. And yet, within the framework of the Climate Summit, they were technically a civil party, so they didn't have any voting power. They didn't have any like decision-making power. So basically they were just there to be talking heads and to make it look like we really care about what the indigenous people have to say about their land, but we're not going to actually give them any power to be able to bring in anything into the actual framework of what we're creating. So right before the COP, there was a really beautiful ceremony that the Pacific Climate Warriors did. And along with the Pacific Climate Warriors, there was a ton of other groups of coalitions of indigenous people that were also in the climate summit. This is a picture of Guardians of the Forest. I included them because they came to the Netherlands last year, and we actually organized like a day of training and stuff with them. It was really awesome. So this kind of shows that like these communities are not just being impacted by what's happening. There's a really big slogan that says we are not drowning, we are fighting. So they're not just standing still with what's happening, they're really actively resisting and actively struggling. The problem is just that they don't have the political power or the resources to actually do what needs to get done. And that's where historical responsibility comes in, of what is our responsibility as a nation, as the Netherlands, and I say our because we're all here in Amsterdam, and you know, you might be from here, you might be from somewhere else, but what is our responsibility as nations that have the resources and political power to help mitigate these issues? Next slide. So these are a few other pictures. This is up top, that's a protest that was done by the Wayuu Nation in Colombia against the Cerrejón, which is the big open coal pit that I was talking about earlier. This is a picture back at Standing Rock, and that's a picture during protests against a hydroelectric dam in Guatemala. So the resistance is alive, it's there. The question is, why are we not paying enough attention to it? And that could be a question maybe for discussion later, but all right, next slide. And so I wanted to go really briefly now into this topic of diversity within the climate movement, because when we look at this whole issue of climate justice, where are the impacts, blah, 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 then we start to wonder, like, okay, well, what are our local climate movements doing about these issues? And at first I pulled up this example, which was a protest that occurred in London in end of 2015, I believe, right? Yeah. Big climate protest, and before the protest there was an organization called Wretched of the Earth, which is a collective of mostly indigenous people from the Pacific and people of color in the UK. Wretched of the Earth was asked to be at the forefront, to lead this climate march, recognizing that those are the communities that are going to be the hardest hit by climate change. What happened was that they showed up with a banner that says, "Still fighting colonialism, your climate prophet kills." They showed up with boards that said, British imperialism causes climate injustice, and the big NGO organizers of this march freaked out and said, no, that's too radical. We can't talk about imperialism. We can't talk about colonialism. We just have to talk about climate change. So what they did, and you can really see it, like, I'm really glad I found these pictures, but they literally took the banner away from them and made them walk in the front with this banner. The People's March for Climate Justice and Jobs, because that sounds so much nicer than recognizing that there is a historical responsibility for the issues that we're seeing. And so you can see, like, here, you can see them here, and they had like their signs still. But it's this contrast of like, this is the general climate movement in, this is a specific case in the UK, but this is what the general climate movement in Europe looks like, including here in the Netherlands. So it's fluffy animals, big fluffy white bunny, a heart, ooh, justice, jobs, yay, climate, right? And this is kind of the reality of what climate change is that it's not fluffy. It's not about polar bears and CO2. It's about the real destruction that this poses for people's livelihoods, people's cultures, people's way of living. So the next slide. So I tried to, in good faith, because I know a lot of people in the climate movement. So looking at pictures, I actually found a lot of faces that I knew. But I wanted to give an example of the local Dutch context. Because last year there was also a People's Climate March here. And so you have People's Climate March, nice and fluffy, you know, like we're here for the climate, we're here for Earth, see me, feel me, touch me, whatever. Don't mess with Earth, it's where I get my tacos. Melting ice is not nice. I found so many just like regular little things about rainforest, this and that. That's fine. But where do we leave the discussion about climate refugees, about these disproportionate impacts that we're talking about the role of capitalism? And so there was a block within the Climate March, which was an intersectional, decolonial, queer, anti-racist, feminist, anti-capitalist block. Yeah. Woo, woo. Yeah. So, and they had this big thing that says, "Stop climate chaos, refugees welcome." And so that's, for example, it's something I didn't go into within this conversation, but when we look at climate change, it forces a lot of people to be displaced. It forces a lot of people to have to migrate out of conditions where they can no longer farm their land, where they can no longer live in their houses because their houses are flooded, et cetera, et cetera. And so what happens is that these people are forced to migrate, and then where do they come? They come into Europe, where all the Europeans are screaming, shut the borders down, refugee crisis, we can't have any of these people come into our continent. And so in the last 2 years, when this whole discussion about the refugee crisis in Europe, and you know, we see boats of people drowning off the coast of Italy and whatever, and we don't question what are the conditions that these people are leaving. It's not just war, it's not just political instability. A lot of people are having to leave the places they live in because of climate change and because of the impacts that climate change is having. And so how can we have a real conversation about solutions for climate change if in the same breath that we say, oh, climate is going to move people out of their homes and it's going to displace people, if in that same breath we then also say, yeah, but we don't want any more immigrants and we don't want any more refugees here. Those issues are fundamentally intertwined. And it's only in a racist, capitalist, white supremacist, patriarchal society that we can think that those two thoughts are okay to have at the same time. That it's okay to want solutions for climate change, but we're not willing to adapt the way that we live and the way that we perceive other people around the world. Yeah, that, basically. So, I just thought this was, because it's like, this woman literally has a sign that says, I'm a climate refugee, where do I go? And this person's worried about tacos. Like, yeah. Okay, next slide. So I just wanted to end with solidarity and allyship, because a lot of this sounds really like, this is not going good and like not enough is being done, and that's true. But on the same token, solidarity and allyship can be a real thing, except for there's a cost to it. Allyship is not just something of like, oh, okay, well, I stand with people in the Pacific. Okay, that's great, but what are you going to do about that? Like, what are you doing, Are you out and going to the protests for refugee and for migrants? Are you going out and supporting those people? Are you going out and supporting Black people when they talk about anti-racism and understanding that anti-racism is a fundamental part of climate justice? What more are we doing? And so that was kind of what and Chihiro will go a lot more into this, but that's what I wanted to leave people with, is this thought of like, what is it that we're doing to be allies with the people that are actually being impacted by climate change? What are we really doing? Yeah, that's it.